On the morning of May 30th, 1806, Andrew Jackson stood across a dueling field in Kentucky from a man named Charles Dickinson, widely considered the finest pistol shot in the state, and made a decision that should have killed him. Dueling etiquette of the era generally rewarded speed, drawing and firing as quickly as possible before your own nerves could betray your aim. And Dickinson was famous specifically for how fast and how accurately he could do exactly that. Jackson let him fire first anyway, a calculated gamble that Dickinson's own speed would come at the cost of precision if Jackson simply stood his ground and refused to flinch. The bullet struck him square in the chest, cracking 2 ribs and lodging so close to his heart that the doctors present that morning assumed the wound was fatal, and said so openly, in front of both men, before the second shot had even been fired. Jackson did not fall. He clamped his free arm across the wound, steadied his own weapon, and took his time. His pistol misfired on the first pull, a hangfire that would have ended most duels right there, honor satisfied, both men walking away with their lives. Jackson simply cocked the weapon again, aimed a second time, and shot Dickinson dead. The bullet in his chest was considered too dangerous to remove. It stayed there, pressed against tissue near his heart, for the remaining 39 years of his life, a permanent, literal reminder that Andrew Jackson was a man willing to absorb a mortal wound and keep standing anyway. This is the story of how that particular quality, an almost frightening capacity to take a hit and answer it in kind, both serve the country and very nearly broke it. Keep that bullet firmly in mind. It comes back at the very end of this story, in a moment almost nobody expected. If you've been following this series through the presidency in strict chronological order, consider subscribing, and let's find out exactly how a duelist from the Carolina backcountry ended up reshaping the presidency itself. Orphan of the Revolution. Andrew Jackson was born on March 15, 1767, in the Waxhaws, a rough backcountry settlement straddling the border of the Carolinas, into a family of Scots-Irish immigrants who had arrived in the colonies only 2 years earlier, seeking better land and greater opportunity than Ireland's own economic hardships had allowed them. A family the Revolutionary War would go on to systematically destroy before their youngest son reached adulthood. His father, also named Andrew, died in a logging accident weeks before his son was even born, leaving his pregnant widow Elizabeth to raise 3 boys, essentially alone on the edge of the frontier. His eldest brother Hugh died of heat stroke and exhaustion during the war, collapsing after a militia engagement in the brutal Carolina summer heat at the Battle of Stono Ferry in 1779, one of the war's countless deaths that never appeared in any formal casualty count. A 15-year-old boy who marched to war and simply never came home. Andrew and his remaining brother Robert were captured by British forces as teenagers while carrying dispatches for local militia, and when a British officer ordered the 2 boys to clean his boots, Andrew refused outright, declaring himself a prisoner of war entitled to treatment as such rather than a servant. The officer slashed at him with a saber, leaving deep gashes across his hand and scalp that scarred him for the rest of his life, wounds Jackson would carry as visibly and as permanently as the bullet still working its way into his chest 3 decades later. Robert died in a prisoner of war camp shortly afterward, weakened by smallpox contracted in the crowded, filthy conditions of captivity. The same disease Andrew himself barely survived after their mother finally secured their release. Jackson's mother Elizabeth, who had walked more than 40 miles to negotiate her son's release from a British prison ship after learning of their capture, died herself only months later, at a location so remote and improvised that her exact burial site was never definitively recorded, having contracted cholera while nursing American prisoners of war aboard British vessels anchored in Charleston Harbor, an act of compassion toward strangers that ultimately cost her own life and left her 14-year-old son entirely alone in the world. By the age of 14, Andrew Jackson had lost his entire immediate family to a war he had barely been old enough to participate in himself. And he blamed the British for every single loss, a grievance that calcified into one of the defining lifelong features of his character, one that would resurface decades later on a very different kind of battlefield outside New Orleans, and that would also shape a lifelong, near-instinctive suspicion of any distant, unaccountable authority, whether wearing a British uniform or sitting on the bench of the Supreme Court. The Duelist and the Frontier Judge. Jackson studied law as a young man, largely self-taught through reading and apprenticeship rather than formal university training, a background that left him with a lifelong distrust of credentialed elites, even as he rose steadily through the frontier's legal and political institutions himself. He moved west to the Tennessee frontier in his early 20s, settling in the rough, rapidly growing town of Nashville, where he built a career first as a public prosecutor pursuing debtors and land disputes across a sprawling, sparsely populated district that required riding circuit for weeks at a time through genuinely dangerous frontier territory. Then as a delegate to Tennessee's state constitutional convention when the territory achieved statehood in 1796, and later as a judge on the state's superior court, a rapid rise built as much on personal reputation and physical courage, qualities that mattered enormously to frontier voters, as on legal polish or formal education. In 1791, he married Rachel Donaldson Robards, believing her earlier marriage to Lewis Robards had already been formally dissolved by the Virginia legislature. It had not. The actual divorce was not finalized until 1793, meaning Jackson and Rachel had technically lived together as an unmarried, and by the standards of the era scandalously adulterous, couple for roughly 2 years before quietly remarrying once the legal matter was fully and properly resolved. The accusation followed both of them for the rest of their lives regardless, weaponized by political enemies decades later in ways that would prove genuinely, devastatingly tragic. Jackson's temper and his fierce, almost obsessive sense of personal honor made him a frequent participant in the frontier's dueling culture, and by 1806 he had already fought and survived several previous confrontations before his fatal encounter with Charles Dickinson, a dispute that began, characteristically, over a horse racing wager and escalated, as these things often did on the frontier, into a public insult against Rachel's character that Jackson simply could not let stand unanswered. The duel itself unfolded exactly as this video opened, Jackson absorbing a near-fatal wound and killing Dickinson anyway, an outcome that cemented his reputation across Tennessee as a man of almost unnatural resolve, equally capable of inspiring devoted, near-fanatical loyalty and considerable genuine fear in the people around him. The story of the man who took a bullet meant to kill him and simply refused to die, spreading well beyond Tennessee's own borders within months. Hero of New Orleans. Jackson's military career began in earnest during the Creek War of 1813 and 1814, a conflict that erupted partly from a broader civil war within the Creek Nation itself between the traditionalist Red Stick faction and Creek leaders more accommodating toward American settlement, though it very nearly ended before it started. That September, Jackson was shot in the shoulder during a violent street brawl in Nashville with Thomas Hart Benton, a future United States Senator, and Benton's brother Jesse, a confrontation rooted in an entirely separate dispute over dueling etiquette that spiraled into gunfire in a crowded hotel. Jackson nearly bled to death on the spot, and the wound remained too dangerous to fully treat for weeks, forcing him to lead his Tennessee militia into the field against the Red Stick faction of the Creek Nation while still recovering from a second bullet wound in less than a decade. The campaign culminated at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in March of 1814, a decisive and extraordinarily bloody American victory in which Jackson's combined force of Tennessee militia, regular Army units, and allied Cherokee and Creek warriors overwhelmed the fortified Red Stick position along a horseshoe-shaped bend of the Tallapoosa River, killing an estimated 800 to 900 Creek warriors in a single engagement. It was a battle so lopsided, it effectively ended organized Creek military resistance entirely and forced the surrender of roughly 20 million acres of tribal land under the subsequent Treaty of Fort Jackson, a treaty Jackson himself personally dictated the terms of, land that stretched across what would become much of Alabama and Georgia, seized even from Creek allies who had fought alongside Jackson against the Red Sticks, a decision many of Jackson's own native allies considered a bitter, unjust betrayal of their wartime service. His success there earned him a commission as a major general in the regular army, positioning him to lead the defense of New Orleans against a British invasion force in the closing weeks of the War of 1812. The Battle of New Orleans, fought on January 8, 1815, was fought after a peace treaty had technically already been signed at Ghent in Europe roughly 2 weeks earlier, news that would not reach either army for weeks given the era's communication speeds, and it became the single most lopsided American victory of the entire war. Jackson's outnumbered force of regular Army units, Tennessee and Kentucky militia, free black volunteers organized into their own battalions, Choctaw allies, and even local pirates under the smuggler Jean Lafitte, an unlikely coalition Jackson had assembled from whatever forces the city could actually produce, inflicted British casualties numbering well over 2,000 against fewer than 100 American losses in barely half an hour of fighting behind hastily constructed earthworks, a disparity so extreme that British officers surveying the field afterward reportedly struggled to comprehend how their own veteran army, fresh from victories against Napoleon himself, had been so thoroughly and swiftly defeated. The battle made Jackson a genuine national celebrity overnight, the hero of New Orleans, a title that would follow him for the rest of his public life and provide the foundation for everything that came after, transforming a Tennessee judge with a violent reputation into a figure of near mythic national stature almost overnight. 3 years later, in 1818, Jackson led an aggressive, largely unauthorized military campaign into Spanish Florida during the First Seminole War, ostensibly pursuing raiding parties across the border, but rapidly expanding the operation to capture Spanish forts at St. Mark's and Pensacola outright, and executing 2 British subjects, Robert Ambrister and Alexander Arbuthnot, accused of supplying and inciting Seminole resistance, after hastily convened military tribunals that many contemporaries and most historians since considered legally dubious at best. An episode so diplomatically explosive that it nearly triggered a formal international incident with both Spain and Britain simultaneously. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, alone among Monroe's cabinet, defended Jackson's conduct publicly rather than urging his censure, arguing that Spain's own inability to control the territory it nominally governed justified the incursion, a defense this series has already covered from Adams's own side, and one that would help push Spain toward finally ceding Florida to the United States altogether the following year, through the Adams-Onis Treaty, a treaty whose eventual existence Jackson's own reckless campaign had done more than a little to accelerate. The first corrupt bargain and the second triumph. The bitter, disputed presidential election of 1824, in which Jackson won the largest share of both the popular and electoral vote, only to lose the presidency to John Quincy Adams through a contingent House vote, widely denounced as a corrupt bargain, has already been told from Adams's side in the previous video in this series, complete with the House Speaker Henry Clay's decisive support for Adams and Clay's subsequent appointment as Secretary of State. From Jackson's own vantage point, the defeat was not merely a political setback, but a personal humiliation he never fully set aside, fueling a 4-year campaign of relentless political organizing, coalition building, and grassroots newspaper agitation aimed squarely at reversing the outcome in 1828, an effort that helped forge the modern Democratic Party out of the fractured remains of Jefferson's old coalition, built specifically around Jackson's own personal popularity and image as a genuine man of the people rather than any single unifying policy platform. a template for mass party organization that would define American politics for the rest of the century. That rematch, covered in detail from Adams's perspective as well, produced one of the ugliest and most personal campaigns the country had yet seen. Both sides now organized enough to fund networks of partisan newspapers specifically to spread their attacks. Jackson's opponents reviving the old accusations against Rachel's marriage with a cruelty that shocked even hardened observers of frontier politics, printed and reprinted across newspapers in every state, regardless of how thoroughly the underlying facts had already been settled decades earlier. While Jackson's own supporters answered with equally vicious attacks, portraying Adams as an out-of-touch aristocrat who had supposedly purchased gambling furniture for the White House at public expense. Jackson won in an overwhelming landslide, 178 electoral votes to 83, a decisive validation after 4 years of waiting and organizing. The triumph arrived alongside devastating personal loss. Rachel Jackson died of a heart attack on December 22, 1828, just weeks before her husband's inauguration, collapsing shortly after reading yet another newspaper attack on her character while shopping in Nashville for gowns to wear at the various inaugural events already being planned in Washington. A cruel coincidence Jackson never stopped dwelling on privately for the rest of his life. Jackson, convinced the vicious campaign attacks on her character had directly hastened her death, never forgave the men he held responsible, carrying that grief and that specific personal anger with him into the White House itself. He reportedly told mourners at her funeral, held at the Hermitage on Christmas Eve, that he could forgive his political enemies for what they had done to him, but never for what they had done to her, and he arrived in Washington the following March, still dressed in mourning black, a president entering office grieving rather than celebrating. The People's House. Jackson's inauguration in March of 1829 became, almost immediately, a vivid symbol of the populist politics he intended to practice. Thousands of ordinary citizens, farmers, laborers, and frontier settlers who felt a genuine personal connection to the hero of New Orleans descended on Washington to witness the ceremony, many having traveled considerable distances specifically because they considered Jackson's election a personal victory of their own rather than merely a change in administration, arriving from as far as Ohio and Kentucky in numbers the capital's limited lodging simply could not accommodate, forcing many visitors to sleep in their wagons or on the ground for lack of any available room in the city's inns. The traditional open house reception at the White House afterward spiraled rapidly out of control. The crowd surged through the building in numbers far beyond anything the mansion's staff had prepared for, standing on furniture in muddy field boots to catch a glimpse of the new president, breaking valuable china and glassware in the crush, until Jackson himself was reportedly forced to escape through a window or side door to avoid being crushed by his own well-wishers. Staff eventually lured much of the crowd back outside by setting up tubs of spiked punch on the White House lawn, a genuinely chaotic public scene that critics seized on as proof of exactly the mob rule they had always feared a Jackson presidency might unleash. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story reportedly calling it the reign of King Mob, while his supporters read the same chaos as proof that the People's House finally, literally, belonged to the people rather than to Washington's established elite. Jackson's approach to federal appointments reinforced the same populist instinct, replacing large numbers of long-serving federal office holders, some of whom had held the same clerkships since Washington's own administration, with his own political supporters, a practice that would come to be known, somewhat cynically, as the spoils system. Built on the frank principle, stated openly by one of Jackson's own allies on the Senate floor, that to the victor belonged the spoils of political office. Supporters called it democratic renewal, sweeping out an entrenched, unaccountable bureaucracy. Critics called it patronage on a scale the young republic had never seen, a permanent structural change to how the federal government actually functioned in practice that would outlast Jackson's own presidency by generations and shape American political machines for the rest of the 19th century. Jackson's own cabinet, meanwhile, fractured almost immediately over a scandal with no obvious policy stakes at all. His Secretary of War, John Eaton, had married Margaret, known widely as Peggy, a tavern keeper's daughter whose earlier marriage and reputation the wives of several other cabinet members, led by Vice President Calhoun's own wife, Floride, refused to socially accept, ostracizing her from Washington society so completely, refusing invitations, snubbing her at official functions, that ordinary cabinet business became genuinely difficult to conduct for the better part of 2 years. Jackson, seeing in Peggy Eaton's treatment an uncomfortable echo of the cruelty once directed at Rachel, defended her forcefully and personally, going so far as to declare at a specially convened cabinet meeting that she was as chaste as a virgin, a stance that deepened his growing rift with Calhoun and elevated Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, a widower who treated Mrs. Eaton with pointed courtesy at every public opportunity, precisely because he correctly read how much it mattered to Jackson personally, into the president's clear favorite and eventual chosen successor. Indian removal and the Trail of Tears. Nothing in Jackson's presidency carries a heavier or more permanent cost than the Indian Removal Act, which Jackson signed into law in May of 1830, authorizing the federal government to negotiate and, when necessary, coerce the relocation of southeastern Native American nations, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, to territory west of the Mississippi River. Jackson had pursued policies pushing toward removal for years before his presidency even began, viewing native lands title within existing state borders as fundamentally incompatible with state sovereignty and, more bluntly, with the continued westward expansion of white settlement he had spent his entire military career facilitating. The Cherokee Nation challenged the policy directly in court, adopting a written constitution modeled explicitly on the United States' own, and pursuing formal legal recognition of their sovereignty, specifically to resist removal through the American legal system rather than armed conflict, a strategy built on decades of deliberate adaptation that included, remarkably, a complete written syllabary for the Cherokee language, developed single-handedly by a Cherokee silversmith named Sequoyah, roughly a decade earlier, allowing widespread literacy and a functioning independent newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, that Jackson's own removal policy would eventually force into exile along with everyone else. In Worcester v. Georgia in 1832, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall ruled unambiguously in the Cherokees' favor, affirming their nation's sovereignty against Georgia's attempts to extend state law over their territory. Jackson simply did not enforce the ruling. He is popularly, though likely apocryphally, quoted decades after the fact as saying that Marshall had made his decision, now let him enforce it, a line historians have never been able to verify in any contemporary source, but that nonetheless captures with painful accuracy exactly what Jackson actually did, which was nothing, allowing state governments and his own administration to proceed with removal, regardless of what the nation's highest court had just ruled, a precedent for executive disregard of judicial authority that troubled even some of Jackson's own political allies at the time. The Cherokee removal that followed, under Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, in 1838, forced roughly 16,000 Cherokee people from their homes at Bayonet Point into hastily constructed internment camps before marching them west on a brutal, poorly supplied route that became known as the Trail of Tears, during which an estimated 4,000 people, roughly a quarter of the entire Cherokee Nation, died of exposure, disease, and starvation along the way. Families burying loved ones in unmarked roadside graves as the column continued moving, because there was no time or provision to do otherwise. Survivors' oral histories describing entire extended families reduced to a single member by the time they finally reached Indian Territory, in what is now Oklahoma. This tragedy unfolded technically after Jackson had left office, but its foundation, the legal authority, the negotiated and often coerced removal treaties, the underlying federal policy, and above all, the willful refusal to enforce Worcester versus Georgia when the Supreme Court itself had already ruled against removal, was built entirely during his own presidency, and reflects his own deliberate, personally championed choices at every stage. the Choctaw and Creek nations having already endured comparably brutal removals of their own during Jackson's actual years in office, the Choctaw removal beginning as early as 1831 and serving, grimly, as something of a dress rehearsal for the larger Cherokee removal that followed, with roughly a quarter of the Choctaw people forced from their homes also dying along the way, with the Seminole resisting removal through years of costly guerrilla warfare in Florida that would continue for another decade beyond Jackson's presidency entirely, the longest and most expensive Indian War in American history to that point. Jackson defended the policy publicly as protective, even humanitarian in his own words, insisting removal would save Native nations from what he characterized as inevitable extinction under continued contact with expanding white settlement, a justification historians today near universally reject as a self-serving rationalization for what was, in practice, mass forced displacement and, for thousands of people, a death sentence delivered by federal policy rather than by war. The Bank War and Nullification. Jackson's deepest, most sustained political fight centered on the Second Bank of the United States, the same institution James Madison, this series' fourth subject and profiled 3 videos earlier, had reluctantly signed into existence in 1816. After his own earlier constitutional objections gave way to wartime necessity during the financial chaos of the War of 1812. Jackson held no such reservations about opposing it. He viewed the bank as an unaccountable concentration of financial power benefiting wealthy elites and foreign investors at the direct expense of ordinary farmers and laborers, a suspicion rooted partly in his own earlier personal experience with speculative debt and paper currency on the Tennessee frontier, where Jackson himself had once been nearly ruined by a bad land speculation deal financed through worthless promissory notes, an experience that left him permanently convinced that concentrated financial institutions preyed on ordinary hard-working men, exactly like his younger self had once been. When Congress, prompted by Bank President Nicholas Biddle and Jackson's political rival Henry Clay, moved to recharter the institution early in 1832, 4 years before its existing charter was actually set to expire, a deliberate attempt to force the issue into that year's presidential election and put Jackson in the politically awkward position of either signing a bill he despised or vetoing it right before facing voters. Jackson vetoed the bill anyway, in a message that attacked the bank's constitutionality in terms considerably more forceful and more explicitly populist than the careful legal reasoning Madison himself had once wrestled with decades earlier, directly appealing over the heads of Congress to ordinary voters in language almost no previous presidential veto message had ever used. Jackson followed the veto by systematically and deliberately withdrawing federal deposits from the bank altogether, redistributing them to a network of state banks his critics derisively nicknamed his peck banks, a campaign that effectively strangled the bank's influence well before its charter formally expired. Biddle responded by deliberately contracting credit and calling in loans across the country, a calculated squeeze intended to demonstrate the bank's indispensability by triggering exactly the kind of economic pain its removal might cause, reportedly telling associates that widespread suffering might finally teach the public and Congress alike the folly of Jackson's crusade. A strategy that succeeded only in deepening public hostility toward the institution, rather than rescuing it, since ordinary Americans experiencing the sudden, painful credit squeeze blamed Biddle's own vindictiveness rather than Jackson's policy for their hardship. The Senate, controlled by Jackson's opponents, responded in 1834 by formally censuring him for what it considered an unconstitutional assumption of power over the Treasury, an unprecedented rebuke of a sitting president that Jackson considered a personal insult of the highest order, filing a lengthy formal protest of his own that the Senate majority refused even to enter into its official record, a rebuke later expunged from the Senate record entirely in 1837, once Jackson's own allies regained control of the chamber. In the war's final political vindication, senators literally drawing a heavy black line through the offending resolution in the official journal itself. The same years brought an even more dangerous confrontation over South Carolina's attempt to nullify the federal tariff, the direct descendant of the Tariff of Abominations signed by John Quincy Adams and covered in the previous video in this series. A tariff South Carolina considered so damaging to its cotton export economy, already strained by declining soil fertility and competition from newer cotton lands opening further west and south, that the state's own special convention declared it void and unenforceable within South Carolina's borders entirely, and further threatened secession outright if the federal government attempted to collect the duties by force. A threat Jackson, the man who had once nearly gone to war over an insult to his wife's honor, treated with exactly the seriousness such a threat deserved. The scheme's architect was John C. Calhoun, Jackson's own vice president, who had drafted the underlying nullification theory anonymously years earlier while still publicly serving in Jackson's administration, and who resigned the vice presidency in December of 1832, the first vice president in American history to do so, rather than continue publicly defending a president he now considered a direct and unacceptable threat to states' rights. Jackson responded with genuine, unmistakable force, securing from Congress what became known as the Force Bill, authorizing him to use military power to collect the tariff and enforce federal law within South Carolina if necessary, a bill that passed despite fierce opposition from Calhoun's own allies now sitting in the Senate, reportedly telling one South Carolina congressman privately that he would personally hang the state's nullifiers from the first available tree if they attempted actual secession, while simultaneously offering, through a compromise tariff brokered once again by Henry Clay, a face-saving path toward de-escalation that both sides could accept without appearing to fully surrender. At a Democratic Party dinner in 1830, well before the crisis reached its peak, Jackson had already delivered a toast that made his position on the underlying question unmistakable, raising his glass to declare, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." A direct and deliberately public rebuke of Calhoun's own toast moments earlier, honoring the sovereign rights of the individual states. A single sentence that would be quoted for generations as the clearest statement of Jackson's own political philosophy on the limits of state defiance. The bullet that never killed him. By the mid-1830s, Jackson's body carried the accumulated evidence of a lifetime of violence and hardship almost impossible to overstate. The Dickinson bullet still lodged near his heart, a second bullet from the Benton brawl that remained in his shoulder for nearly 20 years before finally being removed. Chronic dysentery and malaria contracted during his military campaigns, migraines severe enough to occasionally leave him bedridden for days, and a persistent cough some contemporaries suspected was tuberculosis. All of it managed through the kind of sheer, grinding willpower that had defined him since childhood, rather than any expectation of genuine recovery. On January 30th, 1835, Andrew Jackson became the first sitting American president to survive an assassination attempt when a man named Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter suffering from what modern accounts strongly suggest was untreated mental illness, approached the president as he left a congressional funeral service at the Capitol and fired a pistol at point-blank range. Lawrence had grown increasingly erratic in the months beforehand, telling family members he intended to travel to England to claim a throne he believed was rightfully his, and blaming Jackson personally in strikingly specific and consistent terms for both his own financial troubles and, bizarrely, for an economic downturn affecting the entire country. The shot came close enough that witnesses said the powder should have made it nearly impossible to miss. It misfired. Lawrence immediately drew a second pistol, already loaded and primed for exactly this contingency, and fired again from almost the same distance. It also misfired, an event so statistically improbable given that both weapons had reportedly been tested and fired successfully only hours earlier, that some contemporaries considered it nothing short of providential intervention. Jackson, 67 years old and still recovering from decades of accumulated wounds, including the bullet still lodged near his heart from the Dickinson duel nearly 3 decades earlier, did not retreat and did not wait for anyone else to act. He advanced on Lawrence himself, cane raised over his head, and had to be physically restrained by bystanders, including, according to several accounts, Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett, before he could deliver a beating with his own hands to the man who had just tried twice to kill him. The elderly president's fury reportedly so alarming that it took several men to hold him back. It was, in miniature, exactly the same instinct that had defined the Dickinson duel 3 decades earlier. Take the hit, however serious, and answer it immediately, without hesitation, without calculation for his own safety. Lawrence was quickly disarmed and taken into custody, later found not guilty by reason of insanity at trial, and committed to an asylum for the remainder of his life, spending his final decades convinced he was in fact the rightful monarch of both England and the United States simultaneously, a delusion that never once wavered despite decades of institutional confinement. Jackson served out the remainder of his second term, oversaw the peaceful transfer of power to his hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, in 1837, and retired to the Hermitage, his Tennessee plantation outside Nashville, where he remained an influential behind-the-scenes voice in national Democratic politics for the rest of his life, corresponding heavily with successive presidents, including his own chosen successors, and weighing in publicly on the annexation of Texas in his final years, and continuing to enslave more than 150 people across his lifetime, a fact this series states plainly, as it has with every president who held people in bondage, without softening or omission. Andrew Jackson died at the Hermitage on June 8, 1845, surrounded by family members and household enslaved people alike, the bullet from the Dickinson duel never removed, having remained lodged near his heart for the final 39 years of his life, exactly as it had settled there on that Kentucky dueling field, a permanent, literal fragment of the same violent, unyielding resolve that had carried him from an orphaned frontier teenager to the presidency of the United States, and that had, along the way, both reshaped the office in the name of ordinary Americans and inflicted catastrophic, irreversible harm on people the nation had promised, and then broken that promise to protect. Go back one final time to that Kentucky dueling field in 1806, to a man choosing to let another man shoot first, absorbing a wound that should have killed him and answering it anyway. That same capacity to take an enormous hit and respond with unwavering, sometimes frightening force, won Jackson a war nobody expected America to win outright, carried him through a presidential defeat that would have ended most political careers, and let him survive an assassin's pistol twice at nearly 70 years old. The same restless resolve that had once carried a 14-year-old orphaned, grieving boy out of a British prison ship and into a life nobody watching him at that vulnerable moment could have possibly predicted. It also meant that when Andrew Jackson decided a Supreme Court ruling did not deserve his enforcement, or that an entire people's ancestral homeland stood in the way of what he had already privately decided was inevitable, nothing meaningfully stood in his way either. No institution, no court, no accumulated precedent of restraint. The same bullet that never killed him sat for 39 years at the exact physical center of the man himself, close enough to his own heart that doctors never dared attempt its removal. Proof that Andrew Jackson absorbed damage other men would not have survived. And proof, too, in Georgia and Alabama and along 1,000 miles of forced winter marches, of exactly how much damage a man built that way could do to everyone else within his reach. History remembers the general who would not fall. It owes at least as much attention to everyone who fell because he wouldn't. The Creek warriors at Horseshoe Bend, the Cherokee families buried along an 800-mile winter road, the entire nations whose sovereignty a Supreme Court ruling recognized, and a president simply, deliberately, chose not to honor. Both stories are equally true, equally documented, and equally necessary to understand exactly what the country actually built when it decided, twice, by overwhelming margins, that this particular kind of unbending resolve was precisely what it wanted leading it, a choice later generations of Americans have continued arguing about, in different forms, ever since.